One, I am honored today to have a chance to spend some time with my good friend, President Kagame, and I have had an opportunity, my wife and I, to meet his 4 children and his wife, and I've been working on trying to recruit one of his sons to come join us at the Institute, and I'm hoping I will be successful. The building of a country and the difficulties for many were beyond comprehension to get people to want to live and work together. President Kagame, I'd like if you could take us back in time to when you assumed the presidency in Rwanda and reflect a little bit about the challenges you felt then and how you approached them.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you for the kind words of introduction. From when you want to understand the story of Rwanda, you think back from 1994. Well, you could go before that during the chaos of war, and even before that, the whole history the country has gone through. But let me start it with that background of 94, total destruction of the country, and then when we took office in 1994, I wasn't present. I had been in the struggle to liberate our country. So I became president in the year 2000 under a transition arrangement before we actually had a constitution in 2003. But from 94 onwards, the country had faced almost near total destruction. And we had to build from scratch. We had to build starting with settling people who had been displaced in their millions, others refugees outside of the country. So we resettled the population and had to think of creating stability, introducing and creating basic institutions that would return the country back to normal. This was, of course, always going to be a very difficult task, but we did it from what we could do ourselves, also working with the partners from across the world. At that point, we were mainly having donors contributing money to deal with the humanitarian situation, as also they were dealing with us in rebuilding the country, so to speak. So it took a long time from 94 to 2000, that is 6 years. It was under different leadership until I assumed office in the year 2000. So we continued the journey of resettling back our people who were refugees outside of the country for decades, then other refugees that had fled the country in the period 94, then settling displaced people. So we started investing in basic infrastructure to return water, to families restoring water so that people can have water, then health, then education, and agriculture, trying to fix basic infrastructure. First, that was not there in the first place, or the little that was there had been destroyed. So I moved on. So we started seeing things shaping up, beginning with 2003, when people had settled back in their homes. And then from that time, we've been growing our economy, our country, and more young people educated, business people being able to do their businesses, and we've seen security and stability in our country from that time up to now. As Stacy said earlier, we have seen our economy grow to between nearly 7 and 8% every year for the last 15 years.
Let's take a look today and the lessons. So you had hundreds of thousands of people that were killed. You yourself became a refugee, and you had this divide and hatred that existed and violent attacks on individuals. If we go forward today, we could think about Syria. Tell us how you brought a nation together as we think about, for example, the children or yourself who grew up only knowing civil war or war. How do you build a democracy? How do you get people, of individuals that might have killed members of your family, to decide they're going to lay down their arms and work together? You know, tell us about how that worked and how you reached out even to form a government to bring a country together where so many people had been killed.
Again, one starts with even the thinking that, like our situation, as you rightly said, I grew up in the neighboring country. My family fled Rwanda when I was close to 4 years old. So I grew up in a refugee camp where I spent over 20 years. Like many other Rwandans who were scattered across the region of the East and Central African region. Now, as we grew up, and with all these hardships and the understanding of questions that were arising out of that situation and our own feelings as to how we can resolve the matter, the struggles that we went through, and so on and so forth. In a sense, you come to develop a feeling or the understanding or thinking that, all right, if you have had an opportunity, we have struggled, we have fought wars of liberation, and we have achieved a start of creating a new life for everyone. The question you are faced with is, what do you do to create a situation that all along you wanted, that can give everyone a chance of good life? And if you did not do that, if you don't do that, what is the alternative? The alternative means a continuation of suffering for everyone. So there is something which is very difficult. It's a sort of price you have to pay, in a sense, and I mentioned this.
I mean, how hard is it to tell someone? His Highness Sheikh Nahyan spoke to us about tolerance, the importance of the Pope coming to the UAE in recent times here in 2019. But tolerance for others. How do you get tolerance when you meet a person that might have killed your family, your relative, a friend? How did that happen? And I think we have a real-life example today in Syria and other parts of the world that we could learn from what you did. How did that occur?
Let me sum it up by saying one thing. I remember in one of the commemorations of genocide, trying to remember those who were killed. One of the victims, the survivors, there were thousands of people there, put a question to me. And he asked me, he said, President, why is it that in trying to rebuild the country, and there are victims and perpetrators and others caught in between? In fact, what you have been doing, you have burdened us so much, the victims, with the solution to this huge problem we have facing the nation. It's as if we are the only ones you keep asking, you know, to agree to forgive, to do this, to do that, and it's like, why? Why is it that we are the ones who have to carry the burden? So I was quickly thinking, and I think this is what also was the case. I told the person there, I said, you know, between you, the victim, and the perpetrator, there is only one person that I have to ask of something, and that's you. I can't ask the perpetrator, the person who committed the crime, to offer anything. But I can ask you, the victim, to offer forgiveness, or to try and, if possible, find the courage to overcome your justified hard feelings about what has happened to you or the family, so that we can move forward together and build a good future for everyone. So it's actually you are the only person I can ask to give something. I can't ask the other one, they have nothing to give. And you could see the whole crowd was like discovering that maybe that was true. They are the ones to actually offer something, the victims, who, if they can overcome these justified, the justified anger, the justified hard feelings, even quest for revenge, to say, you know, people killed our families, they killed our friends, they killed our loved ones. So maybe we need to take it to them as well. So that discussion has been helpful, and that's how we have approached it. He said, if we have to build a better future for us, even having learned lessons of the past that, in actual fact, the history, the tragic history we have had in Rwanda, no one gained from it. Everyone lost, including the ones who killed others. Maybe they thought they would gain something, they didn't. No one did. Of course, understandably, the ones who lost their lives and families and so on lost even much more, but they are not the cause or in any way associated with cause of the problem or associated with the problem. So that is how difficult it is, but it is doable in a sense that you're always looking for, if you don't find a way forward, if you don't bring people back together, if you don't allow healing to take place by forgiving and to a reasonable degree holding people accountable for what they did, what is the alternative? The alternative is just to continue with a spiral of violence, killings, and death, and this is not something anyone could afford to think or even allow to continue. So that's how really we have been able to.
I think whether it's Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, or other countries, hopefully, or Yemen someday, the lessons of what you did in Rwanda will work there.
But it will take some leaders to decide in any situation which way they lead their people. And there will always be leaders in any situation and who should have a vision for their countries, and think about their people. And in any situation they are there. In ours, we had that. So we can share these experiences with anyone.
You've just completed your year of leadership of the African Union, and one of the things that Milken Institute events throughout the world, at the more than 200 that occur, we are constantly stressing the importance of Africa. Mm-hmm. And I thought maybe I'd just take a couple minutes with the audience to drive home some of these points before we talk to you about this. 55 member nations, 1.3 billion people, 1/6 of the world's population, 16%, let's say today, projected to go to 40. I think one of the things that people don't realize is just how large Africa is. If you look at the geographic comparisons and measure it in square miles, you see Africa is 11.7 million square miles. So in this case, we're 5 times the size of the Middle East. But as we look at the importance of this area to the world and this MENA conference that we hold here in Abu Dhabi, there's 14.5 million square miles. The United States, the largest geographic area after Russia, China, the European Union, India, where 40% of the people live in the world, and India and China, combined, the geographic area is substantially smaller than MENA and Africa. The challenges of 55 different countries in the region, and one of the things we've tried to do is get people to see the world. Now, when you're a little kid, you're constantly looking at geographic maps. And so when you look at those maps of the world, you see that, okay, Africa has 1/4 of the world's landmass, has 14% of the population. From an economic standpoint, it has a smaller percentage of the world's economy today. But as we think about what relative size might be and understand what the future is and the growth of the world's populations, with most of the world's growth of its population going to occur in Africa, or all of the net growth of the world's population in the Middle East in this next century. So as you look at these projections of 21st century population growth from the United Nations and others, you see this dramatic rise in the population of Africa compared to other parts of the world. And if we look at the amazing developments of medical research that you have been so involved with, President Kagame, and say, okay, where have we increased life expectancy in the world the most? First, in the low-income countries, they have increased by far the most. But if we're going to talk about regions of the world, the 2 regions of the world where life expectancy has increased the most over the past 30 years are first sub-Saharan Africa, and second, the overall MENA regions. And as we look at the percentage of the world's population that's under 14, you see how important this area is. And as we think about the changes that are about to occur in Africa, if we went back to 1900, there was only one country in the world where more than 50% of the population lived in an urban area, that being in the England, UK. Today, much of the world has changed dramatically with more than 50% of the population, and it won't be long before we find that in China and South Asia. In Africa today, only 28% of the population, which lived in cities in 1980, this year it is 40%. So this dramatic movement to urbanization, the penetration with mobile technology, so extension of life. But one of the things that we have seen here is just the political change, which I'd like you, President Kagame, to talk a little bit about. If we looked at Africa in 1972, and we looked at what dominated this continent, the largest landmass in the world, you'll see that you had what we might have called an autocratic leadership or even colonization dominated And so today, what we would call democracy or a more open voting environment, this has changed more in Africa than in any place in the world. And so as you think about your completed presidency of the Union, and we are so focused on the potential of this part of the world, the advances in medical research, the changes in democracy and responsibility of leadership in the world, let's reflect for a moment, if we could, on your last year as President of the African Union and what you would like to challenge us with as we go forward, not only for Rwanda, but for Africa as a whole.
Thank you, Mike. I think we start by putting all this you have stated and shown us together and in the background of what we have to deal with. Africa, endowed with so much in terms of natural resources, human capital, then the numbers were very clear in many senses, 2.5 billion people by 2050 and so on and so forth. Of course, when you look at Africa's portion of global GDP, it's very misleading when you also know what it is capable of, looking at that history you have and the geography you have given us. So that is what we have to bear in mind, and also knowing the history is another thing, but we have to get out of that. It started with slave trade, colonialism, dictatorships, you said, 60s and so on and so forth. But Africa has been overcoming many challenges and moving forward. So for the year I was the chairman of the African Union and working with the leaders of Africa, you mentioned 55 countries. The question is always going to be, how can Africa be so rich yet so poor at the same time? This is the challenge we have to address, and that's what we had to tackle. So, and at the African Union level, forget about the individual level of a country as Rwanda or any other country in Africa, but at the African Union level, we started by saying maybe if we really held Africa together, try the best we can, and sort of make these borders that divide 55 countries kind of irrelevant in a sense of how we can cooperate across these borders, which is possible beginning with trade, free movement of people, goods, services across borders for the economy, for the health of the economy of the continent. We can overcome some of these challenges that really constitute a paradox that I mentioned earlier. At the same time, we cannot work together, 55 countries, without overcoming another challenge where we are so divided, at the same time so dependent on factors outside of the continent. So we have to find a way of building self-sufficiency, self-dependency, and as we cooperate with the rest of the world, that is what is going to give Africa a chance to be where we should be. This is what we tried to drive at the African Union level. And we started by initiating the leaders of Africa met in Kigali in Rwanda in 2016 And in our discussions, we agreed that there have to be reforms. We can't do things business as usual. We have to bring our resources together, work together, change most of the things, beginning with how we conduct our affairs. At the same time, try to, it wasn't really adding up to being inward looking. It was more like simply self-examination and where do we start from as we work with the rest of the world, including, for example, being able to finance the activities of the African Union ourselves, which we are capable of doing. Because if I give you a little bit of what it was, you would find the African Union activities were being financed to a tune of more than 80% from the outside of the continent. Yet we are capable, each African country of the 55 countries can contribute something to make sure that we have resources to run our own affairs.
Well, one of the recommendations, as you know, we've discussed, is the creation of more and more pension plans, saving plans for a young continent where the countries themselves would compound their capital over time.
Yes.
So they'd have more capital and not be as dependent. But we have to remember something like the United States was highly dependent in almost the entire 18th century, 1800s and 1700s, 1800s, on capital from Europe to develop. So it's that combination of the two. If I was to ask you, what are the 3 or 4 things that you want people from around the world to think about Africa and contribute? And likewise, when you sat with the countries, as you've just outlined, what are the 3 or 4 things the countries had to do? You spoke about borders, free movement of people, free movement of goods. I think most of the world is not aware of how far Africa has come. I think you need to visit Rwanda to really see what you've done, but what technology and mobile. But let's talk today of, we're called to action. We have, tens of trillions of dollars of capital represented here and at the groups we intervene around the world. What do you want to see from them? And do you need their human capital also to move to Africa to build?
Let me say, initially, even if one is dependent, you have to make sure that during that period of dependence, what you are getting from outside is invested properly so that you increasingly reduce the level of dependence up to a time you are able to stand on your own, just like you stated rightly, say the case of United States or others, because they reached a point where they were able to stand on their own and even actually start supporting others, like at some point United States started supporting Europe to be able to stand on its feet after a certain period of difficulties. That's what I was also referring to with Africa. It's a matter of history of dependence translating into self-sufficiency and being able to stand on our own feet. And this comes from how do we invest in our people to begin with, so that we are able to prepare them for skills and knowledge economy that every part of the world is headed toward, and that in fact it is already the practice everywhere else except to a large extent African continent. So and the story of Rwanda, what we have done in our limited ways as a small economy in the heart of Africa, still that mirrors what is needed to be done across our continent. It's investing in our people first and foremost, even those countries that have natural resources, they still, all that is going to come to waste or nothing if they don't invest in their people. So that is number one. Second is being able to also invest in technology, technological infrastructure to serve, therefore, the different activities that we will be intending to push forward. Of course, all these things need money, so we have to make sure that Africa is able to articulate its case and the business case around this. How do you invest in people, give them knowledge, skills, at the same time provide what is required in terms of capital for them to be able to do what they want to do. And this means working together within Africa, Africa working together with the rest of the world, and the rest of the world bringing in the capital that is required in our continent to be able to see different activities happen. We see in Africa, for example, a number of startups developing, but there is still need for capital to flow in to encourage that to spread. In fact, we therefore ask the African corporations to be in the forefront, in fact, to try and help these startups to be able to access capital that is required, and also draw in the foreign capital that our African corporations can draw in as they also carry out their responsibility of, because in the end it benefits everyone. If we are able to do this, if the African corporations are able to do that, or do that in a partnership with farms from outside of the continent, I think all of us are going to benefit as we see more entrepreneurs, innovations developing across the continent, in every part. The beauty of all this is that, in fact, knowledge or technology, and these are things that are beginning to be so well evenly distributed across the world. You can see this is, if we're invested in our people, our young people, with education, if they have their health, as we also try to invest in health to a great extent, then they are able to do what anybody else in the world can do. In fact, you find them in different parts of the world doing exactly what is needed in Africa. So we need to, change the whole picture about Africa, beginning with Africans ourselves, both the citizens of the continent, but more so the leaders who really have a task to allow some of the things to happen as they should happen.
Mr. President, that what you've laid out for us here is one, education of your people. And as we think about the world, if we have not educated our citizens, we don't know what the future brings. We have no alternative. The second thing you've pointed out is capital. And one of the exciting things and one of the focuses of the Milken Institute is to think about the deploying of the capital that exists particularly in the Gulf region, and the relationship between deploying that capital in Africa in the future. One of the main themes of the Institute, and essential theme, has been, can we help build meaningful lives? Can people feel they have purpose in their life? And if they don't, are challenges in the future. And I think when you talk about education of your youth, we have that opportunity that if 40% of all the children in the world are living in Africa, and maybe 50% are living in the Middle East and Africa, we've got to make sure there's opportunities. There was a book written called The Epic of America in 1931, and it talked about a country. It didn't identify any country. It had talked about a country where life was full and rich for an individual, not based on whether you're a man or a woman, not based on who your parents were, not based what your religion is, not based where you went to school, but based on your ability to achieve. And we have been filming 10,000 people around the world. And one of the first we filmed was President Kagame. What became known as the American dream is not the American dream. It's the dream in Rwanda. It's the dream in Cairo. And it's this dream. And one of the things the Institute has been doing, and within the next couple years we hope to invite everyone there, is to build this center for this dream, this American dream, which is really everyone's dream. Mm-hmm. And that dream is based on many of the things you've spoken about. Which is why you were one of the first individuals we wanted to film. It's based on education of the people. It's based on health and medical research, which has driven more than 50% of all economic growth. It is based on that entrepreneur that you spoke about and that spirit that changed the world with their ideas. And it's been based on access to capital in the free enterprise system. And President Kagame, we cannot thank you for your friendship. We also cannot thank you for your leadership. And we cannot thank you enough for potentially a roadmap for what countries that have gone through civil wars and strife might be able to follow to create a country like you've done for Rwanda and your leadership at the African Union. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.